an internationally recognized proponent and practitioner in sustainability and regeneration. Bill is a principal in 3 firms, Integrative Design Collaborative, Regenesis, Inc., and Delving Deeper. Bill is a founding board member of the U.S. Green Building Council. He's co-chair of the lead technical committee from its inception in 1994 through 2003. He's co-authored with the 7 group the Integrative Design Guide to Green Building. Bill is a planning consultant, design process facilitator, lecturer, and author. He's participated in over 300 presentations and workshops relating to sustainable, regenerative, and whole system design. Bill has consulted on over 200 green design commissions and dozens of LEED projects. It's my great pleasure to introduce Bill Reed.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everybody. And if you have any questions as we go through this, I understand you can relay them to Mark, and Mark will relay them to me. But if there's any burning issue, I guess, Mark, do you receive emails on this? How does that work?
Well, there's a GoToWebinar control panel, and there is that the attendees see, and there are questions, and so they can type a question in, and I can relay that to you rather than having you go through your own control panel. That's what's worked best in the past.
Okay, good. Well, fire away, everybody. And thanks for being here today. I want to say before I begin that many architects, when they see this whole and living system or regeneration, their reaction is, what does that have to do with buildings? And in a way, it doesn't have a whole lot to do with buildings, except that buildings are the acupuncture point, if you will, or the entry point to engage in working on true sustainability. And so this is very relevant to architects, engineers, planners, developers who are concerned with sustainability. It is not relevant in a direct way to those people who are concerned just about building design alone. So I want to qualify that. So if there's a lot of people hanging up now, that's perfectly okay. So this is about how do we get towards sustainability, and let me get towards true sustainability, not just a limiting the damage approach. This quote that Michael Pollan, and you can all see this, did everybody, is my screen working here?
Yes, it's working fine.
So Confucius advised that if we hope to repair what was wrong in the world, we best start with the rectification of the names. The corruption of society begins with the failure to call things by their proper names. And its renovation begins with the reattachment of words to real things and precise concepts. And Michael Pollan, in the article that this is taken from, goes on to ask, so what about that word sustainable? What does it really mean? And to answer that, sustainability does not, the way we are practicing it as a profession today, no building that we do is sustainable. In fact, it's a concept that we ought to erase from our vocabulary. There's no such thing as a sustainable building. There's no such thing as a living building. A building that, when we do LEED or BREEAM or any of these rating systems, all we can really say is that we are designing buildings that have a tendency towards a sustainable condition, or that may support a sustainable condition. But in and of themselves, they aren't sustainable. Jonathan Porritt, the founder of the Friends of the Earth in England, says, I like this definition of sustainability among many. He says, if you can do it forever, it's sustainable. And if you can't, it isn't. So imagine 100, let me just get to this diagram here. So imagine 100 million of these buildings. This is Swiss Re headquarters in England, in London. It's a very advanced green building. But if we cover the earth with these buildings, we certainly wouldn't have a sustainable condition. So these are not, they're green buildings. They're not sustainable buildings. Elizabeth Sotoris, the evolutionary biologist, likens these to high-performance livers. And if you take a liver out of your body for about a millisecond, it's a healthy liver, and then it's a dead one pretty quickly. And obviously, the context of the whole body is required for that liver to be functional. A building has the context of a whole living system, the organism of community and ecoregion and bioregion, and certainly planet, to be sustainable. The problem is it's pretty darn complex thinking about that, and what today's talk is about: how do we actually practically work with a living system and not just techniques and technologies.
Bill, you had a slide that went through pretty quickly before you showed the tower. Could you go back to that for a second?
I'm going to go back right now. I just wanted to cue this up. So here's a simple diagram. Maybe it's not so simple, but it describes the. Can you see my pointer?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So right now we are working in a technical system world with technologies and techniques. It's fragmented thinking. There are a bunch of pieces. We're gluing electricity and waterless urinals and low-flow toilets and low-embodied energy materials. We're actually gluing them together in an idea that we're actually working towards a sustainable condition. But you've all heard the expression that sustainability as we practice it today is just a slower way to die. That's what we're doing. We're improving, we're moving away from degenerating, giving ourselves more time to work on the real problems, but at some point we hit this line of sustainable. So here we are at conventional practice, as Randy Croxton says, we build our buildings just one step better than breaking the law. And then we move to green. This is where LEED has come in. Well, we can do better. We can do 30 or 50% energy savings. We can reduce our water usage. We can reduce toxicants in the environment. So those are green buildings. And then one might think that if we can shift our buildings to be 100% less bad, there we are, 100% less bad, then we're going to reach a sustainable condition. Well, and what's important to understand is we will never reach zero. We will never reach 100% less bad. So this line is in a way asymptotic. It never really hits that. So, and a sustainable condition, as we're defining it, means neutral, and nature abhors a vacuum. So for lots of reasons, we are never going to reach what we're currently, in our loosely fitting definition of sustainability, we're not going to reach a defined condition of sustainability. That requires us, therefore, if we're serious about sustainability, to not only work in this zone of technical systems design, but to also work in this zone to the right of living systems design. And that requires whole systems thinking and pattern thinking. And we're going to get into that. So the two general categories that are in existence today are restoration and regeneration. And these mean two different things. They aren't synonyms for the same thing. And right now, I'm sure many of you feel that sustainability is one of those banalized terms. A dam project gets put up in India, and people say it's a sustainable project because it's going to protect lives or save jobs. And I had a development director at Exeter Academy say, "We're a sustainable school." "Oh yeah, how's that?" And I was pretty interested. He said, "Well, we have an endowment." So we use that word sustainable to be less than the idealized condition that we're defining in the green building world. What we really need, and this is why this circle is here, is we need both of these areas. We need to be working with technical systems efficiency, and we need to be working with living systems at the same time. And these require two different minds. So that's the introduction. Now, what we're really talking about is life. We're not talking about buildings. Buildings are part of life, and then we can talk about buildings as long as we understand life. But the one thing that we have to understand about life is that it is a whole evolving system. Umberto Maturana defines life as imperfect, the process of becoming. Life is the process of becoming. NASA, in their Genesis project, defines life as imperfect replication. A crystal might be a perfect replicator, but human and mammalian and reptilian life is an evolving life. It continually mutates and changes. And one of the ways to get our hands around what it means to work in whole systems is to actually think about the big environmental imperatives. And I'm going to go through this really quickly since this is I can probably talk for an hour just about this slide. The big environmental imperatives facing us are global warming, lack of potable water, habitat destruction, social justice, air and water pollution, toxicants in the environment, and raw material degradation, or elimination, if you will. It never really eliminates, it just degrades. So we have all these categories, and LEED addresses many of these categories. But we need to understand that what we're doing is thinking in systems. LEED, in fact, to do LEED cost effectively and much more environmentally effectively requires us not to just check the box, little pieces of the environment, but to look at it as a whole integrated system. And that's why integrative design is so important. It's how we save money. That's why green buildings can actually cost less money, because we're actually creating should be creating, very few people are, should be creating an integrative system out of them. But let's think about, I'll use an example from Massachusetts that's pretty telling. Potable water, and just an example of systems thinking. The town of Brockton, Massachusetts, 5 years ago, decided to build that they were running out of water. Now, Brockton, Massachusetts gets 45 inches of rain a year, yet they're running out of water. And the reason they're running out of water is because they paved over, built over, and turf grassed over their entire drainage area. And their water is provided by wells. So when it rains, the water no longer has a chance to go into the ground, and then we pay civil engineers for the privilege of piping the then polluted water with brake linings and oil and waste into the rivers, bays, and oceans. So that shows you that we're kind of doing some silly things. Anyway, Brockton was running out of water, and so they hired I don't know, it might have been GE or some engineer to build a desalination plant, thinking that was going to solve their problems. Now, one of the things we have to understand is that we get our fresh water from the rain. And we get the rain, we can't drink the rain. So therefore, where do we get fresh water? Well, we get it from the ground. It's directly associated with habitat. Bears crapping in the woods, and worms, and microbes, and leaf duff, and dying dead animals, and all that stuff, the kind of icky stuff, is actually creating a matrix of life that is treating and cleaning that water. When we don't have habitat, we don't have clean water. So what Brockton did is they got rid of all their habitat, all their recharge area. There's no potable water. They built this desalination plant for $20 million. And what's interesting is that they can't use that desalination plant because they never coordinated the work with another environmental group in town or committee in town that was working on conservation measures. And the conservation measures were so successful that the desalination plant can't be used. They can't sell the water. It's too expensive. So now it's a $20 million liability for the town of Brockton and the state of Massachusetts because no one thought about how these systems worked together. So if you look at potable water here, potable water is directly connected to habitat. And all they needed to do in Brockton was to open up some recharge areas in their ground, on their ground plane, and they would have fresh water forever. And it would have cost them, who knows, $2 million, $3 million. But instead they bought a piece of technology which did not work within the system that they had working. So the lack of potable water is also directly affected by global warming, social justice, pollution obviously, poisons in the environment, how we actually mine our materials, all affects potable water. All these are linked. And if you look at global warming, it's affected by potable water and habitat and how people use the watershed and plant and rip up forests and obviously pollutions and how we mine our materials. So what we can't do is we can't pick one of these to work on. We have to be working on this as a whole system. And that's when we start we start short-circuiting because we can barely handle doing good energy modeling on a building, not to mention all this stuff. How do we do it? What I want to actually lift up to you right now with a bit of a promise, it is actually easier working with the whole system than it is taking thousands of bits and pieces of issues and trying to glue them together. Think of trying to glue Humpty Dumpty together again. It's impossible. What's required is us to actually start with the raw material. In this case, it's basically sex with an egg, and you make Humpty Dumpty over again. We actually have to start to heal the environment by thinking in living system terms, not mechanical system terms. So pieces of green do not equal sustainability. They're all good to do. It's important that we do them, but they in themselves as independent entities will not create a sustainable condition. So we should be never using or accepting anybody to use the term sustainable buildings, sustainable paints, sustainable light bulbs, no such thing. To give you an example about how this works practically before we get into the how-to, or a little more of the theory, is that this is a project we were working on a few years ago in Idaho. And this is a 3,400-acre alluvial fan formed by this creek called Mahogany Creek coming out of the Big Hole Mountains. This is in Idaho. We are in a plain over the Three Sisters in the Teton Range, and we're looking southwest right now. All the farmers who own this land are going broke. The developer bought them all, and he was going to put 1,000 homes here. And not that we were very pleased that he was putting 1,000 homes here, but he asked us to look at how he could actually be a positive impact on the environment. And some people would think, well, that's an oxymoron. How could a developer positively impact the environment? Well, that was our job to find out if that was possible. So the way we have to be looking at a system is how the system itself works. And if you know LEED at all, and assuming most of you do, you know you get a point if you actually don't harm farmland, if you don't destroy farmland. Now these farms are already being destroyed, but that's not the point. So we get a point for not hurting farmland. Well, farmland is good except when it isn't. And in fact, farmland usually is not good, not the way we're farming. And this is an example to that case. So this is the Teton River. It's a dead river now. I mean, not entirely dead. There's no more salmon in it. Yellowtail cutthroat trout are barely there anymore. The Big Hole Mountains are suffering. And what happened is that when the farmers came there 100 years ago, they dammed up this creek right there, and you can see they diverted it over here to the southeast, or to the northeast actually, and you can see it barely has enough water in it to even reach the Teton River. The farmers take 90% of the water to irrigate these fields. Now can you see the ghost images? I guess I can't hear your response, but yes. Assuming you can see those. Those are the remnants of the alluvial fan. There were many creeks there. In fact, here's the soils map to demonstrate the point. All these red lines are rich soils that came from drainage ways and streams formed by Mahogany Creek, and which formed this delta. It fire-hosed alluvium all over the place. This is about 150 feet higher than the river here. So when farmers came here, what happened is that they diverted this stream and got rid of all this dendritic stream pattern, and what they also got rid of was the breeding grounds for salmon, the breeding grounds for this yellowtail cutthroat trout. Beaver were removed, otter were removed, and the megafauna who migrated up and down these streams were removed. Now, that may not seem so significant, except that when they did this, they destroyed three systems. They actually compromised the Big Hole Mountains, they destroyed this prairie grassland, and they basically destroyed the section of the Teton River. Now what happens just like there's a hydrologic cycle where water actually moves through, it rains and it evaporates, it rains on the land, goes down to the land in rivers, goes into the ocean, evaporates from the ocean, goes up and forms clouds again, and it rains. So there's a hydrologic cycle, overly simplistic, but that's the way it works. There's also a nutrient cycle. When water comes down from mountains, it is taking nutrients with it. And if we didn't have any mechanism to send nutrients back upstream, we would be living on a rock planet. The only way that nutrients go upstream is through fish, insects, birds, and mammals. We, including all those mammals, take nutrients back upstream. When salmon swim upstream, they die up there, they're actually depositing nutrients. In fact, in Alaska, they found out that when they removed salmon from ecosystems, from the streams, the forest began to die. Because what happens when the bear catches the salmon, they take the salmon into the woods, eat the good parts of the salmon, because there's so many of them, and leave the fish to decompose in the forest, and it eutrophies the forest floor. Within 18 months of not having that activity, the tops of the trees started to die. So this nutrient system has been broken by these farmers. And the question is, how can we return that activity and still have farming and still have housing? So what happened here is that even if they did the local zoning code, one house per 40 acres would still maintain these boundaries. And when we came here, we found that this land, every piece of land on the planet has a purpose. Now that may sound strange to people. It's just not dirt, but this land is a living organism. And until we shift our understanding to understand that, we will continue to harm it because we will harm what we don't understand. This land functions as a living bridge between the Big Hole Mountains and the Teton River. Without this bridge of movement, all these three systems are actually in the process of being destroyed. So what that said to the developer and the design team in about 5 minutes, because it's not hard to understand, is that instead of sprinkling 1,000 homes all over the place, they would put houses in very tight wedges and then allow the habitat corridors to be reestablished. And even with 1,000 homes here, they would only use 10% of the water that the farmers are using. So these streams could be recharged with water, which would then also allow the habitat corridors to be reestablished. And they were 1,500 feet between these houses, and within, we'll give you some examples, within a very short time, this system could be working again. And you could even do farming, too, along with it, but you've got to allow this system to be replicated. Okay, so that's the way we begin to start looking at complex systems, because we look at how the system as a whole is working. And what we add to our design teams, we add system ecologists or system biologists to our teams who understand how to look at those systems at a large scale. And why can't I move this ahead? Oh, there it goes. Okay, so a whole new mind is needed to do this work. And what we have a tendency to do, sorry to keep doing this, we have a tendency to work with the elemental mind, data mind. That's the way all of us have been taught in school, reductionist thinking. That's what provides the good thinking for all the science and technologies that we use. But we also need a holistic mind, and that's the right hemisphere. A book to read sometime is Jill Bolte Taylor's My Stroke of Insight, which talks about what goes on in the right hemisphere. She was a brain scientist and describes the process of having a brain aneurysm in the left hemisphere and how the right hemisphere took over. And in that right hemisphere, you can see relationships unlike you can see them in the left hemisphere. You can see that basically life is boundaryless. And that's what's important to understand, is that we're all connected. The microbes in the soil, the bear, the humans, the birds in the air, obviously the water, are all interconnected, and we can't think of them as independent elements. So the elemental mind works on arresting disorder. We're pretty good at that. We minimize impact. This is what the green building movement is doing right now. We problem solve, we restore to the original, we do prevention, conservation. Yet we know above this line there's an agreement, there's an idealized agreement of what it means to create a sustainable condition. But we don't talk about it because we don't really have the mechanisms to do so until recently. But the ancients, indigenous peoples, the Aborigines, the First Nations people had an alternative approach. And it requires a different mind, the whole mind. And their job was not just to arrest order, but was to actually participate and enable a higher order. So some proof of that. This is a beech maple forest in New Jersey, the site of the Willow School, which is a project we've been working on for the last 10 years, on the third phase now. And this looks like it's healthy nature, but in fact it is a compromised ecosystem. These trees are struggling. This forest originally was a chestnut, hickory, oak forest, all thick bark trees, and what's replaced it is thin bark beeches and maples, and I'll explain that in a minute. This is a book from called Tending the Wild that I recommend you at least read the introduction to. Contemporary Indians often use the word wilderness as a negative label for land that has not been taken care of by humans for a long time. This forest used to look like this before European settlers here. And in fact, it probably was even more open than that. When the Louisiana Purchase was surveyed, they found that it wasn't wilderness like we think. It was wilderness with 7 trees per acre. And what we learned is that native peoples managed these forests. In fact, I guess if you go to the largest forest in the world, it was all planted by hand. What we call nature out there is integrally involved with humans taking care of it, tending the wild. So what the native peoples did in California and in New England, well, all along the Adirondacks, Appalachians, was they lit fires in the spring and the fall to burn the leaf tinder. We call them cold fires because there was very little leaves and twigs because they burned them every year. But those cold fires would not hurt the thick-barked chestnut, hickories, and oaks, but they would hurt the beeches and maples. And there was a good reason for that, because the beeches and maples were not as productive a tree for multiple species and humans as the chestnut, hickories, and oaks. So more people and more species were able to live in this kind of ecosystem that you're seeing here than in this kind of ecosystem. It actually had a higher order of resiliency and diversity. So the point of this, William Penn actually wrote in his diary, there was many diary entries by European settlers, but William Penn wrote that he could drive a 4-in-hand wagon, a 4-horse wagon through the woods of New Jersey and Pennsylvania without hitting anything, kind of like a Hollywood Robin Hood movie. So this view of nature that we see now is actually a less effective and compromised one, what we call used to call climax growth, and it's actually struggling. All these plants are struggling for light and nutrients, where this one is much more balanced. Oh yeah, here's a quote from the 1600s. The savages are accustomed to set fire to the country in all places where they come and to burn it twice a year, in the spring and in the fall of the leaf. Okay, so Aboriginal peoples, this is a very important slide. Aboriginal peoples believe that when humans are gone from an area long enough, they lose the practical knowledge about correct interaction. And the plants and animals retreat spiritually from the earth or hide from humans. When intimate interaction ceases, the continuity of knowledge passed down through generations is broken, and the land becomes wilderness. Quick slide. This is a civil engineer. Sorry, civil engineers in the audience. I'm equally guilty, but this is an early civil engineer's view of a stream in Baltimore, Maryland. And the civil engineer was given the task of getting rid of total suspended solids problem because to the north of this stream were buildings and parking lots that when it rained out flooded, surged through and flashed through this stream and ripped up soil and polluted the Chesapeake Bay. So he said, and I met the civil engineer who did this, he said, we knew this was a bad idea, but they said your job is to work on this property, not on the other neighbors' properties. And so he was stuck with just lining the stream with concrete, which of course has multiple things wrong with it. No more water, no more fish, overheated water, etc. Decreased land values, decreased, it's not a stream anymore. It's basically a Los Angeles storm channel. So we know, though, by working outside of the site, and by the way, I'm going to make this statement right now, the smallest unit of sustainable design, or the smallest unit of design to achieve a sustainable condition happens in the largest manageable watershed and or a community. You cannot do a sustainable building, but you can do a sustainable watershed and a community. That's where we have to be working. And when we build buildings, we have an opportunity to tie into those systems or inspire those systems to shift. This is the stream, by the way. So this, 3 years later, though, the state of Maryland has very strict stormwater management laws. They required the buildings to the north to retain their water, and as a result, 3 years later, this is what this stream looks like. This is the downstream view. We know that we can begin to restore systems when we think, if you look at these circles here, beyond the site and into the watershed, because that's the way the whole system is working. All right.
So
now that's
restoration. But upstream are still the parking lots, right?
That's correct, but at least the water is being slowly released, so it's not surging down this.
Thank you.
Now, ultimately, we would hope that we could daylight a stream upstream, in the parking lots too, but that's maybe too much to hope for at the moment. Now, this is an example of restoration. Restoration does not mean to restore something to its original condition. It means to restore a subsystem, like a stream, a woodland, a beach dune system, a wetland. It means to restore them so that they have the capability to self-organize and evolve. It means they have the ability to self-organize and evolve. We can never restore something to its original condition because life changes. Evolution continually happens. So there's no such thing as restoration in the simplistic view of restoring something to its original condition. It can't happen. It's impossible. So now let's talk about regeneration, the beginning of regeneration. This is an example a number of years ago in Santa Fe, New Mexico, northeast of Santa Fe, New Mexico, a 400-acre ranch, and on it has not been any streams, any visible streams in recent settlers' recorded memory, the last 200 years. And the fellow who owns the ranch was going to restore it, so he planted some native species and got rid of the grazing animals and put these gabions in to reduce the erosion in the arroyos, the dry stream beds. Because it does snow and rain in Santa Fe, but only 10 or 12 inches a year. And when the snow melts, it causes erosion. So he did that, and then basically our attitude towards nature is, well, we don't know what's going on, so we'll let, we wipe our hands, and we say, well, we'll let nature figure it out. In fact, our park system, national park system, is an indication of our failure to think. What we're really saying with our park system is to nature is, we don't understand you, so we're going to put you behind a fence, and you can figure it out on your own, while we go outside of the fence and screw things up. And when you think about it, it's kind of a perverse attitude that we go out here and play like undisciplined adolescents when we should be actually working to coexist with nature, not separating ourselves from it. So this stream, well, Vint Lawrence was the owner of this ranch, then heard of the permaculture movement and invited Bill Mollison, who happened to be visiting from Australia. Permaculture is a whole systems approach to ecosystems and human habitation. And they came up here, I'll make a long story short, and they looked at three things. They looked at meteorological conditions, cultural conditions, and because humans are part of nature, and geologic conditions. And what they found out is that this climate has not changed in this area for the last 5,000 years. Basically 10 to 12 inches of rain and 100 inches of evaporation, a true desert condition. They found geologically that underneath, but there was no surprise there, they found geologically underneath a couple inches of soil in these arroyos was rich humus that could only have come from the bottom of ponds. So that was a head scratcher. Ponds in the desert. And then they found out by going out way beyond the site, in fact they went into reading diaries in Colorado, histories, they found out that Wild Bill Williams and his mountain men came south from the Durango area to trap beaver in the desert. So there was a double head scratcher. They couldn't imagine how that happened, but they said, you know, the first impulse was let's bring beaver back. And obviously beaver, sand beaver, if you will. There's no such thing as beaver in the desert. So something was different about this system. Well, they couldn't bring back beaver. Well, what they decided to do is to replicate the pattern of beaver. And beavers, as we know, are dam builders. So they put up in the space of 3 days, or a few days anyway, about 12 check dams, earthen check dams, where beaver would logically have built their dams. And the amazing thing about this is within 18 months, there was a permanent running stream on this site. Now that's the beginning of regeneration. How do humans actually create anew, which is what regeneration means, to create anew. But another aspect of regeneration is what happened after this, is that every farmer down the valley learned from this, and they did the same thing on their farm. And so now there's a whole frothy stream, but there was no river, no stream at all 10 years ago. So we can begin to heal the environment. Now at this point, and basically what regeneration means in its full definition is to create anew and to be born of a new spirit. And that's what these other farmers were. They became inspired, if you will, inspirited to create a new relationship with the land. Now at this point somebody says, well, what gives you the right to mess with nature? Maybe the place wanted to be a desert. Well, number one, we know that it wasn't a desert originally. It was different because the beaver were living there. And number two, what gives us the right to assume we already haven't impacted it? We've impacted every square meter on the planet. And certainly, if you look outside your office windows, you see we couldn't actually do much worse in terms of impacting life, depending on where you are. Certainly the window I'm looking at a strip mall jungle out here. We've done a pretty bad job impacting life. So I think it's up to us to start beginning to see how we can participate with it in a much more healthy and resilient manner. The winner of the Buckminster Fuller Prize this year, Alan Savory, is doing the same kind of techniques. And this is a slide of Zimbabwe. After severe rainfall failures, no rain, he actually has been bringing back a healthy savanna by working with cattle in an appropriate way instead of letting them just run wild, by actually staging them and helping them understand how the system is working. We can actually bring back greater diversity and resiliency. So there's hope. That's what's really wonderful about this. It's just not, you know, if our work depended on just making energy efficiency the predominant goal of green buildings, we might as well just hang it up and go home. Because carbon neutrality is not sustainability. Easter Island, who you probably know, Easter Island was, they went extinct. They were a carbon neutral island, yet they still destroyed themselves because they didn't understand, one of the reasons anyway, they didn't understand their relationship with the systems of life that supported them. So we need to be using both brains, left brain functions and technical issues, and right brain functions and holistic thought. Now, I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to see if you can recognize the pattern here. Is there a pattern in this graphic?
I don't see one.
About 2 out of 100 people get this, in my experience. I didn't get it either. But the pattern is that the lower line has letters formed with curved elements, and the top line has letters formed with straight lines. Do you see that, Mark?
No, I do.
Yep.
I guess it's obvious.
It is, and patterns are that obvious. And what's remarkable is that speaking to audiences, and you say, does anybody disagree with this? There's nobody disagreeing with that. Now imagine that no one is disagreeing with patterns. Patterns are really powerful, and they're actually much easier to work with than a list of 1,000 items that we have to address. And I'm sure all of you know how long it takes to go through a lead checklist and argue which point we're going to go after. I just want to check in with Mark. Is that a fair analogy, Mark?
That's a very fair analogy. Many hours spent with checklists.
Yep. So this is why I'm saying that it's actually easier to work with life if we have the right approach to it. So I don't know if I'm going to go through this example, but this is whether it's rural or urban, it doesn't matter. Jane Jacobs, in her work in cities, was doing regenerative work by looking at living systems patterns, for any of you who are familiar with her. But Brattleboro Food Co-op is a quick story, and I'm going to check time here, just a few more minutes.
Got about 18 minutes to go.
Okay. I'd like to have some time for questions, so let me see if I can speed up here. Brattleboro Food Co-op approached us to do a LEED Gold grocery store. And what we typically tell people is that, do you want to do LEED or do you want to do sustainability? And some people say, yeah, I just want LEED points. And we aren't really interested in working with them in our practice, so we refer them to other people. But there are many people that say, no, I thought LEED was sustainable. Nope, it isn't. So, well, that's what we want, all right? And then we have a client. And so we actually went up to this grocery store and met with the executive committee. And before we started our meeting, I had the executive committee walk through the grocery store, and we turned over apples from New Zealand, and strawberries from California, and blueberries from Chile, and tofu. The president thought there was tofu from Burma somewhere around there. So the question to them was, what happens if there's a truckers' strike? Are you a sustainable grocery store? Nope. What, don't you think that this is an opportunity, because this is a food co-op actually, to bring the nutrient cycle back home? Sure. And so that's why you see this picture here of all these abandoned farms. All of these farms are abandoned around the Brattleboro, Vermont area. And so this grocery store, also we found out the best soil was right in downtown Brattleboro. And people said, well, we built there. How can that possibly be a good recommendation? Well, the point is that it's not either or. It's never that simple. You've only built over, as we pointed out to the board, 35% of the land in downtown Brattleboro. Most towns during World War II fed themselves from their backyards. So not only could this downtown area be a source for food, all these other areas could actually be reinvigorated and the water cleaned up and the forest reestablished into a much more healthy state as part of their effort with the co-op. And they thought that was a little over the top, And in fact, we left with a building program for them that they thought was almost unattainable. And here the building program was this: and to form an agricultural and soil extension service in the co-op, to teach people how to farm and garden again, to test soils, to form a cannery where people could can their own produce, a place for hunters to dress their meat, a credit union to help loan money to people to start farms again, a daycare center to take care of the kids when they were working in the quote-unquote fields, and, by the way, a grocery store. And one guy said when we were done, all we wanted was a grocery store. What is this? This is way over the top. And we left kind of in a funk. They weren't sure what they got out of that bargain, out of that report. Well, a year later, we got a call, and they said, Bill, we want to apologize to you. This is the best thing that's ever happened to us. It's taken us a year to see what you were talking about, but we're now loaning money to farmers. We're loaning money to other co-op members, other co-ops in the region to support a network of food that turns out to be our real mission of sustainability. So the building became, and they're building a green gold grocery store for now, and that's almost beside the point when we're talking about regeneration, because the way to create a sustainable community is to address the whole system, not just the building, and the building becomes the energy point. This works in downtown areas. Just to the left here, you can see where the old river is. It's all, the trees don't lie. That's where the water is. But this building, which is basically a LEED Platinum building, was designed to feed clean water, both human waste, treating human waste on the roof to potable water quality, and recharging all the storm water, which is actually much more difficult than it might sound, to the earth below to recharge this watershed, because they do plan to daylight this stream in the future. What made this regenerative is we got the environmental authorities and the government agencies excited about the possibility of what it means for a building to participate in the larger system. That's the beginning of a regenerative approach. So, really going quickly, what we're doing is working with systems, and a definition of a system is elements in relationships or interconnectionships with a purpose. A system has to have a purpose. If we have a bunch of bicycle parts sitting there by themselves and you don't know the purpose for those parts, you're not going to be able to assemble them into a bike. So we have to understand the purpose of these systems. That's why, if you go back to that example in Idaho, the purpose of that land was to function as a living bridge. Once we understood its purpose, we could begin to work with it. The problem is that we apply closed systems thinking to open systems. Now, a closed system is that which uses energy. And the closed system, like a car or a watch, if you will, takes fuel or it takes a spring to operate the system. And it's very easy to map out what's going in that closed system. But a living system is an open system. And an open system has multiple exchanges. It gets incredibly complex. Yet what we're doing is we are trying to manage an open system with a closed system's mind. And we end up with maps like this. You might have remembered this from the New York Times 4 months ago or so ago. Almost impossible to understand. In fact, it is impossible to understand. It's not useful.
So we have, Bill, we
Yeah.
have a question from Edwin Guerreras asking, so in terms of actual tools and workflows, what would you suggest? It appears you're using GIS, anthropological, and ecological studies.
That is correct. Those form the initial data. But what we need to do is translate that data into a pattern understanding. And I'm going to finish up with that. So bear with me in 1 second. Oh, is that all right?
Of course.
Okay. So you can't use a closed system mind with an open system, and a living system is, of course, incredibly complex. And what we have a tendency to do is to try to use these millions of pieces and glue them together. You can't do it. So we have to actually, instead of quantifiable systems, which are good for mechanical systems, we actually need to work with qualitative patterns. Okay, every place is different. Just some quick summaries. You can't generalize places. Every place on the planet is unique and has its own unique characteristics, processes, and purpose in relationship to the larger system they are part of. They're always nested. There's no boundaries. You can't give a boundary to a place. You know when you leave New York City into New Jersey, you're in a different place. So there's no boundaries, and yet there are boundaries. We have to start learning to deal with paradox. And that's, again, why patterns are so useful, because you can't categorize and create quantities of boundaries around, quantification of boundaries around places. They're dynamically related. They're complicated. They have a vocation, a purpose. I'm not going to get into this, but this land has a purpose. And they have a distinctiveness. One thing that I'll make is a distinction of who these places are, not what these places are. And just using a human body is a perfect example. If I tried to describe me as what I am, there's a big difference between what I am and who I am. And what we have a tendency to do is try to describe land and cities as what they are instead of who they are. Now, I know this may sound a little woo-woo, but bear with me. If you describe me, I would describe myself as Caucasian. I have brown hair. I have blue eyes. I'm 5 feet 8 inches tall, and I weigh so many pounds. There. That's Bill Reed. And you know that that is not very adequate. What you really want to know is who I am. And how we determine who I am is how I am in relationship with other entities that support me. My wife, my kids, my parents, my friends, my colleagues, the dog in the street. How I'm in relationship is invisible, and yet somehow we describe a pattern that is uniquely me. And somehow you take some time, but you can actually figure out how to describe my essence, if you will, the core of who I am. It's the same way with the city, whether it's Paris or the Southwest or New York City or Charlottesville, Virginia, we describe who they are. And this is the way civilizations always held themselves. Every great civilization would describe who they were, not necessarily only what they were. And that's why they use stories. Stories hold these qualitative understandings. And every great civilization is a storytelling civilization. So the way we begin to hold these complex patterns is through stories. Now, how we do that, if you read Daniel Pink's A Whole New Mind, you'll get the basic same ideas that I'm going to describe here. Is that you have to know yourself, you have to have empathy for relationships, you have to recognize pattern, you have to describe them through narrative or story, and then you can design. You have to do that before you start designing. So what we do is we basically gather data, we assess the human and ecological patterns, we create the story of that place from those patterns, we design, and then we also have to engage the community to develop their capability to understand that themselves. Now, what's exciting about stories is that communities and clients love stories. They love to know how they are part of a system. It is the most generative and exciting way to begin doing green design. Instead of just going through a lead checklist, which is not very exciting, I think you can admit, when you start actually engaging people in how life works and their role in life in that place, it changes their state of being and mental model and mental availability and interest to being superbly excited. So that's the future, is to actually get people to fall in love, if you will, with life again, because that's the only way we're going to start taking care of it. So what is our role and purpose? To inhabit the earth, not just occupying it. From living lightly on the land to living fully with the land. We just can't care about pieces only. You just can't care for my part, NIMBYism, not in my backyardism. We actually have to be working to understand the whole of life in that community, which means we have to repurpose our role. And we have to be able to see the mind that can see life's development. This is the next big step in green design. People are using the term regeneration now in many places, and what's interesting is that the field is ready to actually begin to think this way. We're actually getting an incredible amount of work now from people that want to go further. So this is not just pie in the sky stuff. It's really happening out there. So pay attention. As Christopher Alexander says, when you build a thing, you cannot merely build that thing in isolation, but must also repair the world around it and within it, so that the large world at that one place becomes more coherent and more whole. And the thing which you make takes its place in the web of nature as you make it. So I'll end up with that one. I'm done.
Thank you, Bill. If people want more information, if you could go back to the slide that had your contact information on it, are there links at integrativedesign.net?
All in the back have many. Let me just see. Yeah, there you can see. But if you go to Integrative Design down here and go to the resource page, you'll find a number of websites that I'm affiliated, companies that I'm affiliated with that are doing very similar work, or some aspects of this work.
All right, and so there on the screen, the integrated integrativedesign.net and regenerativeCommunities.com. You ended on a hopeful note. I think in Pakistan right now there are 100 million people up to their ankles in water, and they're talking about the Three Gorges Dam not being strong enough, and they're talking about 1 billion people having to walk for water each day. Do you think that the advances and moving toward regenerative design can happen in those communities as well? Is it? It's not a rich versus poor, is it?
Well, I've got two thoughts, and they're actually contradictory and somewhat offensive, but I'll share them anyway. We're working I just got off the phone. One of the reasons I was late is I was on the phone with Tuxtla, Chiapas, Mexico, and they've had massive flooding this last week from the tropical storm and the number of deaths. And so we're meeting with the governor down there. My colleagues were down there with the governor. And there is a lot of hope. And the community was inspired by not just building another dam, but actually solving the problem. And they were actually excited about participating with it, not just buying one more piece of technology. Now, the other side of it is that, yes, we can, if we actually teach people how to live this way, we can support much more life on this planet. We've actually reduced the carrying capacity of this planet so significantly by not paying attention to how life works. Yet, in many places, we have exceeded any level of carrying capacity. There's going to be death. And one way what may be offensive to some is that I think we have to recognize that we all die at some point. And not only think, we do die at all. We all die at some point, so we have to get over it. And we have not paid attention to the life support systems on this planet, thinking that we can occupy it instead of inhabit it. And there's going to be a tremendous amount of death in the next, I would guess, 10 or 20 years because we have avoided that. Nevertheless, in Haiti, we're working with the villagers to understand how to actually become sustaining by working with these principles. So I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth because that's the way the world's working. We aren't going to solve it all, but I believe we can solve a significant amount of it if we think systemically.
Well, I hope you're right. I hope we can think our way out of this and design our way out of this. And on behalf of CSI and the group that's attending, I'd like to thank you very much for your presentation. Again, I'd like to remind people to either of your websites there to stay involved. And thank you very, very much. As we wrap up here today, again, please stay in touch by email. Our next webinar for the CSI Sustainability Practice Group is September 21st. If you want to mark that on your calendars, you'll get an email automatically. If you've attended this webinar, it's from 3 to 4 o'clock on Tuesday, September 21st. The topic for next month will have to do with sustainability and BIM and how you cram both performance requirements and sustainable design requirements and building products into BIM. There are a lot of firms that are using the advantage of the database of the models to include information, and we'll be showing 4 or 5 ways that you can not necessarily link BIM and specifications and sustainability, but include the information. So you'll have both type and properties and parameters, and that will be our topic next week or next month. I'll be leading that group along with Bob Wygant and some other people who have actual examples of how you can include sustainability in a model and pull out reports. So with that, we're coming to the end of our session. Thank you all for attending, and please tune in next month.